Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. At last count, I think we had over 50 people who have signed up. So thank you to each and every one of you who have joined us this evening. Um, this is a UC Alumni UK event, and all the proceeds go to UC Diversity and Inclusion initiatives back at the University of California across the campuses. So welcome to Creating Racial Equity in Our Communities, a panel. And just to introduce myself, my name is Jason Mullering. I am the newly appointed president of UC Alumni UK. I'm going to take this opportunity, because this is my first public act, to just acknowledge the previous president, Catherine Townsend, who served our board for 2.5 years and did a great job. I also want to welcome Claire Frost, who's our newly appointed vice president. So let's get to the event at hand. This panel and this topic is obviously very important, and it's something that as a board we started talking about in 2020. So in 2020 there was a response to further killings of Black women, men, and children, and the Black Lives movement gained significant traction last year, not just in the States but around the world. And since that time, and really for a long time, this goes back way further than 2020, there's been a call for significant change in the systems that benefit from inequality and oppression of minorities. So as a group, as a board, we've been asking, what can we do to further this conversation and create change in 2021 and beyond? So UC UK Chats is now officially a series. We had our inaugural event over a year ago where we were focused on global citizenship in the wake of Brexit, and for a group of people who are affiliated with the University of California who live and work in the UK. We thought that that was really important. So obviously we're taking on very topical conversations and wanting to bring experts and practitioners to these conversations. So stay tuned for future events, and we'll talk about that at the end as well, and how you might get involved. Just so you know, there will be an audience Q&A after the discussion. And so for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, and I think we're all probably pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, please use the Q&A function on there. If you have any technical issues, please put those into the chat, and we will try to address them as quickly as we can. I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us and sharing their time and expertise. We have an absolutely fantastic panel, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say and where this conversation goes. And I'm going to let Edie introduce them in turn. And speaking of which, I want to give massive thanks to Edie Lush, who is our moderator and who was with us at our inaugural event. She returns, and we're very grateful and thankful. Edie went to UCLA, and that's how she's affiliated with us. If you don't know Edie Lush, she is an award-winning journalist, events MC, and communications trainer. She hosts events and around the world, from Davos to Cannes Lions to COP climate summits. So enough from me, and please welcome Edie Lush. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Mullering. First time I've said that. So I remember 29 years ago studying for my finals at UCLA and listening to the radio as Los Angeles erupted with anger after 4 LA police officers, 3 of them white, were acquitted of the savage beating of Rodney King, a Black activist and author. And I remember those 5 days really clearly. But that was only one moment in recent US history when the US was reminded that what the Declaration of Independence says, that all men are created equal, is simply not true. That the way Black bodies are policed, are judged, are treated is very different than the way that white bodies are. And in my podcast, I sometimes say that on the subject of diversity and inclusion, we don't have to make the world any more diverse. It already is. But we do have to work very hard and a lot harder on inclusion. 2020, a year that many of us, including me, ran out of adjectives. During the pandemic lockdown, I watched, the world watched, as Breonna Taylor, Daniel Prude, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Dijon Kizé, Walter Wallace Jr., Jonathan Price, Casey Goodson Jr., Andre Hill, all died at the hands of police, fatally shot or suffocated to death. And in other news, in 2020, we know that Black and Hispanic people are more likely to be hospitalized or die from COVID-19. So how does the US make the Declaration of Independence more than just a fable of the founders? How can this time be different? And how can we help move forward and create real equity? So to help me discuss this, and I'll invite you to turn on your cameras as I introduce you. On the other side of London, Olamide Noah is getting her MA in Human Rights Law at SOAS. Before coming to sunny London, she was the Director of Digital Strategy at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Dr. Jamal Myrick, Director of African Student Programs at UC Riverside. And coming to us live from UCLA, go Bruins, Dr. Laurie Fraser is Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, Acting Director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. I am also delighted that all of the questions that have come through tonight have come from you in the audience. So thank you for making it so easy for me. If you want to comment, discuss what we're talking about as we go, do use the chat. That is the benefit of the digital event. If you want to ask questions to the panelists, do use the Q&A function, and Zara, who's hidden behind the UC Trust screen, will feed those to us as we go along. So let's kick off. I'm going to ask Olamide and then Dr. Myrick to answer this first question. What was it about 2020 that woke up the world to the issues facing people of color? Why was there such a big response?
Thank you, Edie, and so excited to be here first and foremost, and to be able to speak alongside such phenomenal experts on this topic as well. I think, you know, one of the things that comes to mind in terms of why there was such a response last year was the sheer inhumanity behind the George Floyd killing. Right, we're thrown into a pandemic. All of a sudden, you can't go to school, you can't go to work. You're sort of locked inside, and we're facing this virus, this enemy that attacks the respiratory system. And a lot of people were living in fear. On top of that, the news was full of mortality rates rising, our healthcare systems being overwhelmed, communities of color being at the epicenter of those instances, right, and still being more affected by other communities. And even in this moment where there seems so little hope to be had, and where it seems like we're kind of galvanizing together to try to fight, this assailant together, you still have white supremacy rearing its head in a fatal way. And not only was it fatal, the way in which it happened, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of Derek Chauvin's knee in George Floyd's neck, literally suffocating him yelling, "I can't breathe," bystanders yelling, "You're killing him," supposedly doing the things that we thought were the right things to do in this instance, where it's, record it, engage if you can. But of course, these citizens are afraid to engage themselves. You have that, and it's shocking. It's shocking that even in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a time where the country should be galvanizing together, we still are facing white supremacy as our sort of ultimate enemy here. And I think in that moment, people had to reckon with whether or not they aligned with that or not, and what they were willing to do to show that they did or did not align with that. And when you don't have the distractions of your typical 9 to 5 schedule, and when we're all sort of locked in, you and screen time was going up dramatically during this time, it was impossible to look away from it. It was impossible to ignore it or to be a bystander. And I think a lot of people rose to that occasion by taking to the streets, and not just in America, but in 200 countries across the globe, on every continent, in every state. And that's because the plight of Black lives isn't just an American plight. It is something that is felt across the globe as a result of colonialism, imperialism, and systems that have been in place for centuries.
Dr. Myrick, what would you add?
Not much. I mean, Olamide did fantastically well on really conveying what was going on. The only piece that I would add is what you and what all of us really got to see was a tale of two pandemics. And I think when I reflect on last year, 2020, and I think about what was going on since March 16th over here, literally that's what it was. You had killings after murder of Black bodies by state sanctioned violence. And you, like Olamide had just shared, like you had to be home. You had no other choice. Essentially, you had your phone, you had your internet, and that's literally everywhere. And so I think a lot of folks had the space to just kind of be, and folks were getting challenged, and folks were called to task, especially I'd say white folks were called to task to kind of get your own and figure out what's going on, and not allowing Black and brown people to always do the labor of educating and trying to say, like, here's what's going on. Like, you're now home. You don't have as many distractions. You can't go out to a brunch. You can't go to a party. This is what you're seeing right now. And so folks had to really reconcile with that. And I am happy to see that a lot of folks did get involved and did get engaged in their local communities to figure out what was going on and to fight. And I know when in some of the spaces that I've been in is really challenging folks to not just allow this movement to be a moment and allowing it to continue even after the fact. So I would push people to say, well, what are you going to do 6 months from now, right? So in June, I was in a community event. And it's like, what are you going to do 6 months from now? Like, yes, all the tension is happening and there's a lot that's going on, but what are you going to do 6 months from now, a year from now, when a lot of the conversation is quelled? And taking people to task. And I think that's what was happening during this, like I said, this tale of two pandemics. Thank you.
So, Dr. Fraser, we have a new administration in the US. We have the first woman of color in the White House. What do you expect or ask of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in terms of tackling racial equity and responding to Black Lives Matter?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be in this space with you today. Racial equity is at the top of the Biden administration's immediate priorities list. But the public policy issues related to Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement are alongside COVID relief, climate change, economy, healthcare, immigration, and restoring America's global standing. I just didn't make those policy issues up. Immediately when going to the White House page, you see that long list of immediate priorities. So racial equity is among those immediate priorities. He has also brought to the table those who have worked in organizing around issues related to policing and the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the promise of fulfilling many of these issues remain a dream deferred even during the Obama administration, despite the hard-fought gains of Obamacare and marriage equality during the Obama administration. Many of these issues like immigration, like racial equity, like climate still remain a dream deferred. So when you couple that with bringing together the kind of historic, diverse electoral coalition that the Biden-Harris administration needed to defeat Trump, that also means that this administration is transitioning to a governing coalition. It's transitioning from electoral coalition to a governing coalition across various political attitudes and policy preferences amid a coalition that is so diverse and more diverse clearly than during the last 4 years. So even during the best of times, this was very difficult to coalesce all of these diverse interests around racial issues, right? And that's going to be increasingly difficult now that we have, COVID relief, a huge bill that the administration is trying to push through, even trying to garner bipartisan support. So here we are. In this era where we need to focus on some of the hardest hit racial ethnic communities during the pandemic as they're struggling to survive this global pandemic, but also they're struggling to gain basic human dignity and imagine surviving a traffic stop and getting away with their life to get back home to their families and communities. So here we are. What organizers know now, unlike they verbalized and were as ready to go in 2008, they know that they have 2 years. They have 2 years before the midterm elections where the executive branch, the House, and the Senate, by a hair's margin, right, with a 50-50, with Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote, they know they have 2 years to hold the administration accountable along racial equity issues, because they also know the power of the ballot and the power of Black women and the vote, right? And so they're organizing in a way that I didn't see in 2008. Right? We stayed in inauguration stage for a long time after 2008. And we celebrated the inauguration on that, fateful Wednesday. And we were excited about the Biden-Harris ticket. And then we rolled up our sleeves and folks began to organize and get to work again, right? So this is something that I see as a sea change, different than in 2008 around racial equity issues and holding the Biden administration accountable.
Olamide, what would you add to that from your perspective now internationally?
I wholeheartedly agree with Lori. I think something that's really remarkable about this time is, and also probably a result of the last 4 years and the climate that we've been in for the last 4 years, is that people are hitting the ground running, and organizers, activists, lobbyists are hitting the ground running to really move these things forward. I'm also encouraged by the moves that the Biden-Harris administration has already made just in the first 30 days. And that is, frankly, I think a remarkable change. There are, of course, bills that I think are intimately tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, such as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that I would say are just paramount changes that need to be passed through. But from an international perspective, I think rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, for example, and restructuring and healing the ties to the international community is necessary, because something that we've actually already seen is the international community galvanize on a grassroots level. We just talked about the awakening that happened worldwide in 2020, and we're still seeing the effects of those today, right? You have the NSARS movement, for example, in Nigeria. You have indigenous rights movements that are happening in Australia to this day, and the United States, again, being able to be a level-headed negotiating body in the international community is critical, and it trickles back into the Black Lives Matter movement.
So, Dr. Myrick, one of the issues that has come out of this entire movement is a question around the police. And there's a phrase, defunding the police. I want you to talk us through what it means and what it might look like.
Yes, thank you for that. So first, I want to just make it extremely, extremely clear. American policing has never been and never will be a neutral institution. I just want to make sure that that is clear from the start. Everything is political, and policing is one of those pieces. And I'm not talking about Republican, Democrat. It's biased. There's folks that are operating these organizations and these institutions. So I wanted to make sure that I make that clear first and foremost. The second piece, when it comes to defunding, and Dr. Frazier and I in the panel, we did talk about this just a little bit ago, about making it accessible to folks that may not be in our spaces. And so thinking about reimagining what the definition is. So essentially what defunding the police means is really reallocating a divestment, if you will, of funds to other spaces, to other organizations, back into the community. So I think about, for example, here in Southern California, LAPD specifically. So the LAPD has about $3.1 billion of a $10.5 billion budget. And so that money has been, according to the mayor of LA, that they're going to reallocate 150 million of those dollars of that $3.1 billion budget. They're going to reallocate about $150 million to the community, to service Black folks, to service Black and brown communities. And really what it is taking that money that is traditionally given to these police organizations and to these departments that's funding the militarization of these organizations, that's giving the guns and giving them everything that they need, taking that money, putting it back into education, putting it back into mental health services, putting it back into the community for programs and opportunities to better the local community. I think about there's about 13 cities that have been defunding the police or reallocating the budget very well. I think about Austin, Texas. And so if you call 911 in Austin, Texas, you'll actually get connected with a mental health professional first on the phone, and then they'll connect you to the police department or the fire department or another mental health service to get you the support that you need. I think about in New York City, they're also working on reallocating a lot of their budget to, again, go back to education, to go back into social services that's actually helping the community grow and get the support that they need. Because really about 9 out of 10 of the police calls that take place, there's really no need for the police to come out. There's really no need for the police to come out guns blazing when I know that, oh, my person is having a mental health breakdown. There's no need for somebody to come charging into the house with a gun, right? And so really making sure that folks are getting the opportunity to get the support that they need, and they don't have to fear calling the police. They don't have to fear, oh, I need to make sure that my house is okay, or my house is in order, or I have my ID on me. Because those are things that I think about if I have to contact the police. I'm like, do I have my ID? Do I have this information that says that this is my space and I am protected? And folks shouldn't have to live in fear. They shouldn't have to be in fear for things along those lines. And so when we're talking about defunding the police, really what we're talking about, once again, is reallocating the budget that a lot of police departments get. Now we're putting it back into the local communities, putting it back into social services and education that will better support the needs of the community and make sure that we're fostering a better experience for those community members, particularly in Black and brown communities.
Dr. Fraser, what would you add to that?
I just wanted to say that was excellent. And again, defunding the police, about the reallocation and redirecting of funds from the police department to government agencies. I just wanted to give one example recently in California, and then just a quick example of how it also hits home. And I'm not from California, I'm from the south side of Chicago, but we're all sort of disentangling many of these issues. And though we are here with PhDs and fancy degrees, and for me, I'm teaching young folks around some of these issues. I'll just start with the personal experience as the defunding the police, that the rhetoric around defunding the police began to rise. I'm immediately thinking about my family, and some of which are a part of law enforcement. My sister is a Cook County sheriff. She's the best at her job. She's amazing. And so some of these terms, right, are difficult for folks to understand when they're not in these kinds of academic spaces and using this kind of academic jargon. And so, but also here at UCLA, these terms are what we're working very hard to help people understand right here at the university community, but also our broader community. And so again, you are not alone if you're just trying to figure out what the terms mean. How is it that we can reimagine policing that is equitable and fair and just and humane, right? And while also redistribution, reallocation of funds from one pot of money, oftentimes your tax dollars, to measures and things that that the community cares about. So one example of that is on November 3rd, in the past election, the voters of Los Angeles County approved Measure J, hard-fought gains here, which dedicated no less than 10% of the county's locally generated unrestricted funding to address the disproportionate impact of racial injustice through community investments such as youth development, job training, small business development, supportive housing services, and alternatives to incarceration. And so again, the language around the Measure J, goes on here. I'm just giving a little snippet of it. But again, the advocacy around imagining and pushing for something new, something different with your tax dollars, right? The defunding the police oftentimes mean a divestment and a reinvestment, a reimagination of community policing. It is not to do away with law enforcement, but to help us overcome some of the ways in which policing of Black bodies, for example, has also meant, discrimination at the hands of authorities, right? And so by going back to my wonderful sister who's a Cook County sheriff, for example, at the same time that she works in the jails and she's a part of law enforcement and has been so for decades, she also has to deal with her body being policed as a Black woman. So the different things in which we think about when we're pulled over by the police, how we're going to comport ourselves. And when I see the police or when I am engaging with the police, I'm not coming at it from necessarily that they're there to protect and serve, right? I'm definitely aware of my surroundings, and if I'm doing everything proper, I'm not answering questions, and this is going to be quick, right? And so all of those kinds of things I talk about with my family, as well as trying to help the broader community understand what these terms mean as it relates to tax dollars, reallocation, redistribution of funds.
Thank you. There's a comment actually in the chat, which is worth just pointing out. Do you think it's enough money? It's only 5% of the budget, Dr. Myrick.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, when you historically look at, some of the local communities that have been impacted, particularly Black and Brown communities, look at the school systems, you look at the youth services, the after school programs, things along those lines, 5% isn't going to cut it. But I also think about, well, what about if they never received it anyway, right? And so I think about the work that a lot of the activists have done in the local community to make sure that, hey, at least we get this, and it's a start. Whereas I think right now it's timely, right? It's very, very timely. And I think now folks are like, hey, let's hold these people accountable. Like, you promised X amount of dollars, let's get more for next year. And let's play, but let's be strategic about how we can keep the money and hopefully increase if and when necessary. But 5% is not, that's just a drop in the bucket. To me, I think it definitely needs to be way more.
Okay, so we're not going to shy away from addressing the big issues here. So Olamide, let's give this one to you. White supremacy, white nationalism, how do we address this?
I think that is a really massive question, and I think it's at the top of the sort of social consciousness right now, which is actually very exciting. I think first and foremost, we should acknowledge and appreciate the fact that we're speaking about white supremacy, not only in this space, but we're speaking about it in the media. It's become something that we can name directly and speak about in a way that I haven't seen us address so freely in the last few decades. And I think a part of that is because of what happened on January 6th. And a big part of that is what happened throughout the last 4 years of the last administration, culminating in the insurrection that happened on January 6th. You can no longer say that divisive rhetoric is just rhetoric, that it's just words, and that it isn't violent. It is inherently violent, and it will produce violence, and it has produced violence, and we saw that. And I think that in order to address that, that comes from a top and a bottom approach. I think at the top, we need to make sure that white supremacy is labeled as domestic terrorism, that they are registered terrorist organizations, and that they are treated as such. That the terrorization of communities of color, that the killing of Black people is a crime, right? And unfortunately, what we have seen time and time again are people get acquitted or not indicted because of the fact, for various facts, but all that does is perpetuate this idea that the taking of a Black life isn't a crime, and we need to reaffirm that it absolutely is. I think one of the models that we can follow is the process that Germany embarked upon after World War II, where they went through a process of denazification and of trying to address the fact that this was an ideology that was extremely violent and divisive, and that they don't want that to be a part of the fabric of Germany. It is very much a part of the history, an unfortunate part of the history, but they didn't want that to be a part of their future. And so they went through a process of making sure that to align with those views was actually a crime. And I think that that's important, that there needs to be something lost when someone is so bold as to identify themselves as a white supremacist. And so I think from the bottom, that's where that pressure, that sort of naming and shaming, the cancel culture, I think is actually a really great tool in that regard. I am encouraged when white supremacists lose their jobs. It just shouldn't be, it shouldn't be something that is so widely accepted that people can ascend into various tiers of leadership while donning this badge, right? And so I think while there should never be a limit on, you know, free speech, et cetera, we do have to then reassess you know, the arguments that were used over the last 4 years in that regard and how that led up to January 6th, and acknowledge that speech is violent. It can become violence. And we've even seen that in the wake of January 6th. You know, Stacey Livingston in Texas, who is now being terrorized by a white supremacist neighbor in her community, right? And has had to sleep in hotel rooms and not feel safe in her home because of the fact that not only were there folks who flew into DC on January 6th to be a part of that insurrection, but there are communities of people who didn't make that flight, but still felt aligned with that message and who are very active in their community. And unfortunately, in Stacey Livingston's case, the police are not treating it with its, you know, if they're not doing their due diligence, they're not treating it as the threat that it deserves to be treated as. And I think that's where we start to see a shift, is those acts, those hate crimes needs to be treated as domestic terrorism crimes, and the punishment has to fit the crime.
Thank you. So questions coming in. Dr. Myrick, there's a question about accountability. So how do we hold ourselves, our governments, our local governments, councils here in the UK, for example, and our communities accountable for inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Fraser kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit earlier about making sure that you're paying attention to your elections, the midterm pieces, paying attention to what's going on in local government. So like I mentioned last year, when the protests were going all over the place out here in the United States, and I was in a community meeting, and that piece about self. So how do you hold yourself accountable came up. And I mentioned, I was like, well, first and foremost, continue to make the commitment, like, this is going to happen. This is now going to be a part of me. Like, I'm going to take this experience in this moment, and I'm going to continue to make it a movement in my life. And I'm going to continue to learn. I'm going to continue to educate. And also, I'm going to have someone to help support me and hold me accountable for my actions. I think there's a lot of unlearning and relearning that we have to do as individuals. So individually, I think that's one of the first steps. And I would also offer to get involved, like I said, in your local politics, but more importantly, be registered to vote. So I know folks are like, why am I going to register to vote? I was literally on another conversation yesterday, and we talked about the power of mobilizing. And when you need to call on your senators, you need to call on your Congress people, you can say, hey, I have 50 registered voters that want to come and talk, that want you to be present. That hits a little bit different because they want your votes, right? And so again, being strategic about how you are navigating in these spaces, I think when we're talking about in the community, one of the things that I've learned in my time, not just doing the community work, not just here in my higher education career, but just in life, it's notice notes. And that's what I like to call them. And so a lot of times we are very siloed, and even right now we're very siloed. And I think sometimes it takes someone to say, hey, Dr. Fraser, have you noticed, you know, the school budget in Riverside County is a little low? I didn't even think about that. I've noticed that. Right. And you start kind of galvanizing, and you're starting to get folks on board to some of the movement that you're paying attention to. And you are going to, again, have a long-term plan for what change is going to look like and for how change can happen. So I think even about civil rights, the civil rights movement, which is something that a lot of folks talk about, it wasn't an immediate change. It wasn't something that happened in a year. It wasn't something that that just took place. Like Black and brown folks, they were marching for months. They were marching for years. They were out protesting for years before the Civil Rights Act was actually implemented. And we're still fighting for civil rights to this day. And so it is a long game, and it is a long time, and it takes a lot of investment. And so when you're thinking about the community, like I said, do a notice note. Have you ever noticed? And then you're just kind of building the coalition, so to speak. And then also in terms of the government, like I mentioned, first I would say be registered to vote. And then, reach out. The power of the pen is so underrated. With the Breonna Taylor's murder that took place out here in the United States, my wife and I, we were calling any and everybody in Kentucky to make sure, hey, like, we need to take this to trial. I think the power of social media has definitely revolutionized activism and what activism can look like, and utilize social media to not just be topical, but be intentional about how you're holding folks accountable, calling your senator, calling your local council member, and showing up to city council meetings. Again, getting involved in your local government, I think is important too. I've been able to go to city council meetings and I'm like, wait, this is what's happening in my area. And these are the propositions that folks are trying to push. And this is the stuff that's affecting my life and my family on a day-to-day basis. And so those are the things that I would say. So first, if for yourself, continue to do education, continue to have that commitment, and also have an accountability person that can hold you accountable and you can talk through some of these situations with. For community, like I said, do notice notes, and then also get registered to vote, and also call on your community members and local organizations that have Black and brown lives at the forefront of their missions to come forward and get the support. And then finally, for your local government, or for the government, I would say definitely get involved in your local politics, show up at city council meetings, and get these people to task. Like, you all voted these folks in, let's hold them accountable to what they're saying. And sorry, I took a little bit more time than I anticipated.
Oh, amazing. So that accountability question is really important for business as well. Dr. Fraser, how would you create lasting change in corporations, which have so much influence in our lives?
Sure. Well, that was, okay. Just making sure my mic is on. So that was really great. It's hard to come after that one because you just really laid out some action plan for us all here. I'm thinking about how everybody can be great because everybody can serve. As you were talking, I was thinking about Dr. King's everybody can be great because everybody can serve. I tell my students all the time that you don't really have to have a fancy degree or a fancy title to help us secure the kind of democracy that you want to live in. And some of those action steps that you laid out for us are so helpful with that. When it comes to for-profit entities, the first thing I do is try to make sure folks know that they are not alone in the need to pause, right? And so for many of the folks who are in the audience who are working for corporations or for-profit entities or nonprofit entities, or even some of you who are in academic spaces, the first thing that I want you to know is that as I was watching the insurrection, I'll just give this as an exemplar. When I was watching the insurrection, so many different emotions swelled up in me like they did for you. And also so many contradictions of America's and democracy's promise, right? The contradiction of, a few weeks later, we're going to inaugurate the first Black female, right? In the United States, the first Black female vice president. In weeks to follow this insurrection. But in that particular moment, all I could, see or hear was friends who had been hurt during BLM protest, or, all of the different stories and the narratives from journalists and others who had documented BLM protests, for decades, right? Listening to other journalists like Joy Reid as they were commenting about what was going on with the insurrection. So you're seeing all of these different contradictions. And the first thing I did was to pause and to figure out, how am I going to deal with this? And before I speak publicly is what I wanted to know. And during this time, I received a number of calls to do print and media interviews. And I decided no. And I actually didn't speak publicly until Martin Luther King Day, right? From the insurrection to Martin Luther King Day, because it was important for me to gather myself as a Black woman, you know, teaching at the #1 university in the public university in the country, and to make sure that I can bring my best self while I'm also dealing with the contradictions of America's promise, of America's democracy, right laid bare in front of me after all we've been through for the last 4 years, right? And so in doing that, I think this is, because I was kind of taking my own advice for leaders of CEOs and other executives, where I advise all the time, right? Bring folks to the table, right? That can help you craft statements or craft responses. Oftentimes, the folks that are in this audience are getting pressured to make a reaction right now. We want to hear what you think right now. So it becomes knee-jerk rather than empathetic, rather than thoughtful, right? Rather than authentic, right? It is something that you feel like you have to do. I don't feel like I have to respond right now, but I'm going to gather myself, right? Bring people around me to have thoughtful conversations about this so that I can bring my best self to the table. And that is what I'm noting that can work best. That doesn't mean you sweep it under the table, you don't address it, you hide from your employees and you skate the issues. But there are folks out there that you can bring to the table to help you bring your best self. And it's okay that you don't have all the answers, right? You're not a race scholar. You don't have a PhD in political science and study racial ethnic politics for decades. You may be managing a company and you have, you're trying to increase diversity, but you have very few folks, right, who are diverse, but you know that you want to reach out to them. Here's the last thing I'll say there. Be thoughtful when asking Black coworkers, colleagues, friends to give their time, to share their ideas. Pause for a second if you are a leader. Understand that you're asking your Black colleagues, coworkers, friends, employees to share their stories and experiences, many of which may be associated with personal trauma. And now you're actually asking the traumatized because you just want to know, you just want to, can I can you offer me some ideas? Can I talk to you about this? But that trauma is often, and those experiences that you're asking them to share is oftentimes based in discrimination and bias. And so as you allow yourself to pause and understand that you don't have all the answers, the same folks that you're asking for advice, the 1 or 2 Black colleagues, right? For example, they don't have all the answers either, but any advice that they do have, it might be based in trauma or experiences of discrimination and pain. And so all of these things can take just a little bit of thoughtfulness, bringing people who are well-versed and educated in these issues to the table that can help you craft statements and make other kinds of things on social media to make sure that you're making the best decision for yourself, for your company, but also for moving the conversation forward.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for such a thoughtful and heartfelt answer. Another massive question. I'm going to give this one to Olamide. Olamide, I'm sorry. So guns. I've lived here for 22 years and people still ask me about why guns in the US. The questioners said that they feel safer living in the UK because of the difference in the gun laws. Do you think it's likely for any systemic change in policing and national gun policy that could impact institutionalized racism and violence towards Black bodies and people of color?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with this question firsthand as someone who's been in the UK for just a couple months now and already feeling that sort of sense of a little bit, there's public safety seems a little bit more real here, right? Because of that really stark difference in the proliferation of guns and how guns are pretty ubiquitous in America and not so much here. And I think, one piece of legislation that I mentioned earlier, but didn't really get into was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, because what we're seeing now, it's very unfortunate, but Daniel Prude being an example of that, is it's not just people being shot and killed by the police. It's also people who are being held in chokeholds by the police or in other positions that compromise their ability to breathe. And it isn't just people dying from it, but it's police officers doing this maneuver over and over again and being able to move to different departments whenever one department gets too hot. And I think one of the things that I'd really love the Biden-Harris administration to reinvigorate and sort of have a concerted push behind is getting the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed through the Senate. It's already passed through the House, but we were in a situation that was a little bit more divisive a couple months ago. But through that piece of legislation, it would ban chokeholds. It would create a federal database of police misconduct, which is absolutely critical because time and time again, what we're seeing are police engage in a form of misconduct, and instead of actually being decertified as a police officer, they're able to go to another precinct or another department. It would ban no-knock warrants, which is the warrant that was used when Breonna Taylor was murdered by police in Louisville. And it would grant the Justice Department the ability to issue subpoenas to do patterns and practice investigations of police departments to uncover these patterns and practices of discrimination. And that's something that the Trump administration sort of barred them from doing, but we can sort of quickly lift that veto, if you will. And so I think from the policing perspective, those are issues and those are moves that we can see actually make positive change as it relates to the fatality that comes from the system of white supremacy that policing is founded upon. But a lot of those changes are going to happen at the local level as well. So not just this federal mandate through the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but also local governments having to reassess their use of force, to bring community to the table, to have these discussions about what is appropriate use of force, to institute, as Dr. Myrick was saying earlier, various public safety regimes or public safety professionals so that someone with a gun isn't going to every call to 911. And then when those things are implemented as they are in Richmond, actually making sure they're used, because in Richmond, where that 9-year-old girl was just pepper sprayed, they actually have rolled out a place for people to call when they're when someone is having sort of a family dispute or having an episode, but actually using those systems and also informing the public as to those systems and how to get in touch with each of those when they determine that they need help. And so I think it is obviously going to be something that is a long time coming, and justice doesn't happen overnight, but these movements and what we can see happening at the federal level can get us on the right track.
Thank you. So there's a question about, you raised the German denazification issue, but that the question is saying that actually pushed anti-Semitism underground rather than eliminating it, a little bit like the war on drugs, if you remember that one. So how do you get to the cause of racism rather than suppressing its external manifestation? Dr. Myrick.
Olamide looks like she had something, so I want to
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, definitely, I would love for you to jump in, but I suggested that as a model that we can use by looking to the past and understanding the fact that we aren't the first country, we aren't the first society to have something rear its ugly head that we have to overcome, but by no means is it a silver bullet solution or something that we should follow to a T. And I think as it relates to getting to the cause of racism, what's unfortunate about America's history is that it's very hard to untie that knot, if not impossible to untie that knot. I can't think of a system that operates today that would not have either that is not founded in some ways or reminiscent of or perpetuates white supremacy if it is allowed to progress without any critique. And so I think it's our position, it's our responsibility to critique every system, right? To critique everything that we see and to look at the results of our, carceral system, look at the results of our education system, of our housing system, et cetera, and say, this is having a disparate impact on these communities. And so we have to reimagine it in order to rectify that. It's very similar to the, defund the police conversation that we're having now. And we're starting with the police, but to be frank, there are many other systems that are in the crosshairs of this movement because they also need to be completely reimagined if we're going to have an anti-racist country.
Thanks. I want to, you know, always want to make sure. I was like, got to make sure Olamide gets her point in. So I would just kind of add to that the idea of this critiquing and the critiquing of institutions for sure. I would also offer to critique of self. I think it's really, really important before you ask, you know, how can we dismantle racism? I think sometimes it's just as important to ask, how am I either reinforcing it or how am I actually upholding and exuding racist tendencies and or essentially white supremacy. So how am I carrying on these traits? How am I in my circle or my sphere of influence? How am I reinforcing these beliefs, whether it's in my organization, whether it's my department, whether it's how I connect with a colleague? I've been in quite a few anti-racist trainings and I've seen folks say, oh, yes, I'm anti-racist, so I'm great. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. It's ongoing unlearning, it's ongoing relearning, it's a constant shift. And I agree with Olamide, like if we all had that one answer, I think the world would just be like a better place. But we don't. And so all I can offer is just some takes and some thoughts. I do agree that it's not just racism, it's a lot of these different institutions and isms that come about. If we continue to sit here and think about racism as just this one singular issue, we've already failed. So thinking about intersecting identities and thinking about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, gender, so on and so forth, disability, all of these identities that we take for granted. And so, yes, it is important to focus on or pay attention to ending racism, but essentially to get to the core, you need to really pay attention to white supremacy and how these white supremacist ideals are playing out in policies, procedures, budget, and how it's affecting all these different perspectives and all these different identities. Because again, if you just focus on racism, then you're not seeing the whole of the person. You're not seeing the whole of these various communities. Because yes, if we defunded the police and took care of policing, there's still food insecurity that's happening. There's still mortality rates that Black women are experiencing with pregnancies. There's a healthcare system that is unbelievably anti-Black and have a lot of issues there. And so it's really approaching it from like I like to call it the God view, and really pay attention to all of these different intersecting perspectives and what you can do to challenge in your sphere of influence.
Dr. Fraser, I'm inviting you to come in. There's another interesting question. Would a public forum or trial such as the Truth and Reconciliation, such as we saw in South Africa, be a useful tool to address racial inequality in the US?
Well, right now, that's a great question. Right now, what we are dealing with is we are in the process of impeaching the president in the United States, is that we're having a difficult enough time holding accountable leaders that their actions were laid bare on international television, right? And so, again, we sit at the helm of the executive branch, the House, and the Senate in the hands of the Democrats. So that's a very good question to pose for what they plan to do in terms of holding leaders accountable. Yes, we need to have an open discussion, but you can look as far back as or as recent even as the Clinton administration, with a lot of kinds of, conversations about race and courageous conversations about race. We've been trying to have a courageous conversation about race for so long, but where do we move towards action around overcoming some of the issues that the panelists have just noted? We've seen firsthand how the pandemic has exacerbated already serious pre-existing conditions, economic and racial inequality, all of these, the intersections of health and income and education and housing, and all these social vulnerabilities. They were there long beforehand, while alongside elected officials were calling for a conversation about race, right? The pandemic exposed all of the existing or persistence of how race and nativism and xenophobia and discrimination had on all of our intergroup relations, right? And how they helped to further divide not just around racial lines, but I'll give this one example about the local, how we're trying to distribute the vaccine, right? And this ties directly to housing discrimination and long legacies of racial and ethnic disparities and discrimination in the housing industry, and why we have the haves and the have-nots still here in the United States with regards to housing. Well, some communities would like to have grocery stores, speaking of food insecurity in the United States, grocery stores to administer the vaccine. That sounds well and good. And that seems like they're bringing in a lot of sort of heavy hitters, because a lot of grocery stores in the US administer flu shots, for example, right? However, not every community is equally served in terms of public goods and services, and high quality grocery stores, right, that would be those administering the vaccine. And so therefore, you're going to have a systemic inequality. But that systemic inequality didn't start with the pandemic. It started with the fact that communities are underserved. Communities of color have been long underserved in terms of fresh fruits and vegetables, right? And some of those high quality grocery stores just haven't found their way to minority communities. And therefore, they're not going to be the place of solace for getting a vaccine. And so again, getting to the root of these problems and having a courageous conversation about it is something that we all would like to have. However, many folks would like to get to action around these issues, because we know what we know with regards to, we can see it laid bare, and the pandemic has shown it in even greater form. And now it comes to, how are we going to get the vaccine into the arms of minority communities and gain the trust that they, when they do become available in minority communities, that they will feel trusting in the government and other authorities to take the vaccine, for example.
What do you think real signs of meaningful progress are going to look like if we look a year ahead? What could that look like, Olamide?
I think that some of the things that we can see in the immediate are the Trump era policies being repealed to the extent that they can be. And again, I would say that I'm very, very encouraged by just the executive orders that have been signed in the last couple of weeks, and the direction that things are going on in the last couple of weeks. But to really piggyback off of Dr. Frazier, which is very difficult to do, but I will try. But I think right now, we can't decontextualize this and take this out of the fact that we're in a pandemic that is taking American lives every single day, specifically Black and Brown, poor, Indigenous, trans American lives. And so in this rollout of this vaccine, I think that'll be one of the indicators, right? If in a year, the communities who were affected most by this are no longer the most affected communities. If their transmission rates or infection rates and mortality rates are level across the board, and we're not seeing what we've been seeing for the last year.
So a couple more questions. What about improving equity and inclusion in higher education, Dr. Myrick?
Oh, don't get me started. Don't get me.
And I know you've worked here as well in the UK as well as the US.
Yes. So I think there's four things that come to mind in terms of staying committed to DEI work and staying committed to equity and inclusion. So first, I think a lot of higher education institutions need to think about and really wrestle with what does DEI actually mean for our campus? What does it mean for the student experience? Are we talking numbers? Or are we actually talking about creating safe and equitable spaces for Black and Brown and Indigenous folks to come to this campus and be their full true selves? I'm so sick and tired of folks saying, yeah, let's be diverse. And we increased our numbers of Black and Brown students, but then those Black and Brown students are leaving. Right. And so are you truly creating a space that is welcoming and that Black and Brown students can see themselves in policies and procedures? Next, I would talk about budget. So really looking at your budget and like, where's the money going? Is the money going to this one-off program that's celebrating Black History Month? Or are we really talking about initiatives and campaigns to really make sure that Black and Brown students have their needs met, especially in this environment? I think that's really important to think about when we're talking about, how can institutions stay committed to equity and inclusion work we're in a pandemic right now, and there's no need, there's no need and no reason why a scholar at any of our institutions should go without a laptop or a router or the things that they need to actually, do their work and be a scholar. And so really paying attention to the budget lines, paying attention to how you actually show that you care what for the equity of Black and Brown students on your respective campuses. You can't tell me that you care about equity and diversity and your cultural centers on your campus has less than $50,000 to operate a program and just kind of thrive. And then third, I will also look at the policies and procedures of the institution, and as well as faculty and staff in the departments. What are y'all actually doing? How are you upholding, going back to what I said a little bit earlier, how are you upholding white supremacy? How are you keeping others at the margins, whether intentionally or unintentionally? I was just in a session yesterday, and one of the faculty members is actually creating the syllabus with her students. And I think that's so powerful, because so many times we sit here and we talk about, oh, we're working for our students. And I'm not going to apologize, because I'm getting really passionate about it, because this is something that I've seen through this COVID-19 experience, where institutions are promising equity and diversity and they're failing. And so when we're talking about showing up, are you showing up just for, or are you actually showing up with? And that's two different things. How is your institution working with those communities that are impacted right now? How is your institution coming up with programs, initiatives, student success? Or is your program, is your students included in your strategic plan? Are you actually showing them your strategic plan? Are you showing them your budget? Right. And so again, when we're talking about policies and procedures of an institution, how are you including your students? And I'm not talking about, oh, let's put them on the search committee just this one time, just so they can have a voice. No, how are you actually and actively including your students with your students? How are you doing that with them? How are you creating this experience with them? And then finally, I'll end on, who do you call? And so when you're talking about commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, are you calling a quote unquote expert outside of your campus? You're giving them $5,000, $10,000 to speak for an hour and a half, or are you really looking to the experts that's on your campus right then and there that you never call to the table? Right? You only call them to the table when it's fun and it's exciting. But are you calling these people to the table before something happens? Are you being proactive in those manners? And I think that's super important to when we're talking about the commitment of institutions of higher ed. How are you doing it? Here are the reasons, and I'll go real quick once again. So again, reflecting on, what does DEI mean for your organization, for your department? Looking at the budget, where's that at? Policies and procedures. And then who are you all calling to make sure that the voices that need to be heard at those tables are received at those tables?
Really interesting. So fascinating you mentioned the voices that need to be heard. And just a final question, because I see we're running out of time. I want to give this one to Dr. Fraser. There's a question about everyone's voice needs to be heard. There's a terrible phrase. Well, there's an objection. All lives matter. But I know that as a university professor, you have all kinds of students, even at UCLA, in your classes. How do you bring everyone into a conversation where you can have difficult conversations, but make people feel like they're able to contribute and be listened to?
Sorry, that's a really great question. And it's something that I think about every time I enter the classroom. I'm very self-aware of my presence as a Black woman in that space. I'm the first woman of color hired in the political science department on the tenure track in 2007, the first to earn tenure in 2015. So I know that a lot of the students, women of color and others, are looking to me and to make sure, do I have all the answers to give out? But also all the students, how do I address the concerns? I want to make sure that I'm bringing students into the conversation rather than doing something to make them, to push them away from the learning process, right? So I'm always keeping that at the top of my mind about the growth of knowledge. How are we growing knowledge together, right? And that doesn't mean we all have the answers right? Or the best answer, but we are moving towards growing knowledge, right? And then you take that knowledge into the streets on your own, right? However you plan to use it, but we're growing knowledge together. Let me just say something about the debate around All Lives Matter as a retort to Black Lives Matter. I think about the Sojourner Truths, Ain't I a Woman, right? Or the iconic strikers who wore the signs, I am a man, right? And this was the iconic signs that were worn in Memphis during the sanitation strike of 1968. And it was the garbage truck sanitation strike. Black people and Black bodies have long been trying to manifest for others that they belong, right? Ain't I a woman? I am a man. Black Lives Matter, right? Being an affirmation, right, to the self and to the world that our dignity, our basic human rights, right, matter. That doesn't detract in any way from your basic human rights to be a woman, to be a man, to be a Black person, right? But the affirmation, right, first internally, but then externally via the slogan of Black Lives Matter, that my basic human dignity matters, right? That is the most basic fundamental, right? Not riches and gold, but the basic fundamental that it's okay for me to occupy this space, in this body at this time, right? And so again, I don't get into the weeds about the All Lives Matter. I'm not going to win that battle, right? In fact, I'm going to have people who just turn me off, right? But instead, I go to the historical context of Black folks affirming for themselves and then the broader community of their womanhood, of their manhood, with images, with stories, right? With facts about that. Black Lives Matter is a very powerful slogan, is as a part of a long history of Black people being forced to make folks understand their basic human rights and dignities as a woman, as a man, as a person, right? And it just didn't start with Black Lives Matter, but it is an outgrowth of a long historical context that is wrapped in white supremacy and legacies of discrimination that we're all still trying to untangle and to teach, and to also gain just better understandings towards the growth of knowledge.
Thank you very much. That was powerful. I see that we're out of time, so I'm going to hand back to President Mulring, but I want to give an enormous thanks to you in the audience, and especially to our panelists for coming tonight with incredible ideas, concrete actions, and really thoughtful comments. So Olamide Noah, Dr. Jamal Myrick, and Dr. Lori Fraser, thank you so much.